Welcome again to the Jewish Teen Funders Network Professional Learning Series webinar, Jewish Sensibilities, Tzedakah, and Beyond. What makes us Jewish? Embodied in teaching, stories, and collective experience, Jewish sensibilities are both a link to Jewish tradition and an evocative vocabulary for discussing what we care about most as Jews and what makes Jewish wisdom meaningful and relevant in the contemporary world. Members of the Jewish Teen Philanthropy community know that Jewish sensibilities play a central role in the Teen Foundation experience. Whether through composing mission statements, researching potential grantees, or conducting site visits, teen philanthropists are making real grants with real dollars through the frame of Jewish values, delving beyond the concept of tzedakah through enriching texts and activities. During this webinar, we will hear from two leaders at the Lippman Kanfer Foundation for Living Torah, who will discuss the role that these Jewish sensibilities play in our lives. I am thrilled to welcome President Jon Woocher and Director of Organizational and Jewish Learning, Rabbi Lee Moore, who will be leading today's session. Jonathan Woocher is the president of Lippman Kanfer Foundation for Living Torah, an organization that promotes and supports efforts to help Jews and others engage with Jewish wisdom and sensibilities in order to lead better lives and shape a better world. Prior to assuming this position, Dr. Woocher worked for 27 years at JESNA as president and then as chief ideas officer, where he headed the Lippman Kanfer Institute, an action-oriented think tank for innovation in Jewish learning and engagement. Dr. Woocher is the author of Sacred Survival, The Civil Religion of American Jews, and numerous articles on Jewish education, community, and religious life. He serves on the boards of the Covenant Foundation and Bikurim, an incubator for new Jewish ideas, and is an active volunteer in his synagogue and community. And Rabbi Lee Moore is Director of Jewish and Organizational Learning for Lippman Kanfer Foundation for Living Torah. Prior to becoming a rabbi, she worked in the fields of organizational and community visioning, environmental sustainability, and spiritual retreat production. She also serves as a Hillel Senior Jewish Educator on the campus of Kent State University in her hometown of Kent, Ohio. And I'll add that I am blessed to consider Jon and Lee colleagues for a long time now and friends. So I want to thank you for joining us today. And I will now hand the webinar over to Jon and Lee for their words of wisdom.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie, for the invitation. We're thrilled to be here. Jon, is there anything you want to say by words of hello before we get started with the activity?
Just echo the appreciation for the invitation and the opportunity. And Stephanie, thank you for giving us this chance to interact with the folks who are part of this Funders Network.
Great. So we're going to do something that I've actually never seen done in a webinar, which is we're going to try to do a group activity. And the mechanism we're going to use for this group activity is the Jewish Sensibilities card deck that, I don't know if you can see my video, it's here on the PowerPoint presentation as well. I understand that most people who are on the call have received this deck in the mail. So if you have, please now take off the rubber bands and pull out these cards. You'll be looking for the blue cards, just the blue cards. There are 11 blue cards. If you do not have a deck of cards, you have no idea what I'm talking about, then to participate in the activity, use a browser and visit jewishsensibilities.org. And on that website, you'll see a picture of these 10 blue cards that I'm referring to. So I'm holding them up in my video screen as well. So we're going to start off the webinar. It's going to be a little quiet, actually, because the first part of this activity, this is a very active webinar, the first part of this activity is to actually read through all 10 of these blue cards. They're not very long. Each card, as you can see, has, like the one on the screen, Simcha. You'll find a Jewish sensibility articulated in Hebrew, and then transliteration, a brief translation, a one-liner that kind of describes one way of thinking about this sensibility, and a short paragraph. So I'm going to take just a few moments and ask everyone to actually read through all 10 of these cards. And as you're doing that, wherever you are, I want you to choose 2 cards. I want you to choose one that is the card that you identify with the most as you're reading these through. When you see these sensibilities, you say, oh yeah, that's me. And I also want you to choose a card that you struggle with, anything that you struggle with in any kind of way. So were we all together, I'd ask if there are any questions, but I think it's pretty straightforward. So we're just going to take about 5 minutes of quiet. Please go ahead and read through all 10 and choose one card you identify with and one that you struggle with. Okay, as you read through the cards, you may have a difficult time. There may be 2 or 3 that you want to choose, either for what you identify with or what you struggle with. So I encourage you just to choose one of them. Okay, so not being able to go on very many visual cues, I'm going to assume everyone's had a chance to do this. And we'd like to open it up actually and ask for some participation. Is there anyone out there who is willing to share the 2 cards that you chose, and just a few words, not a long speech, but just a few words on why you chose the cards that you chose and how that connects you to your Jewishness? I guess if somebody is a nachshon in the audience and interested to do this, so then I think you need to unmute yourself and then start speaking. Okay.
This is Daphna. I'm happy to share.
Yeah.
I know I kind of got a leg up on it, but I'm
right.
Mine.
Well, it looks like Sonia Marie
great.
chose Israel. Sonia, could you share? Do you want to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about why you chose that one? How does she unmute?
There's a small icon on the bottom of the screen, left side. It looks like a microphone, and it says mute or unmute.
So yeah, if you take your cursor all the way down to the bottom of your screen and to the left-hand side, and then click on where it says unmute, unmute. Okay, while Sonia's doing that, Daphna, perhaps you can share.
Sure. So I think for me, certainly working in the Jewish world, Shvira Just this idea of brokenness is very hard for me to work through. That there are successes and there are times when you wish you could have maybe done something a bit better, or something may have turned out better. And I find that that's kind of one of those concepts that you should be following, but it's very easy to kind of get caught up in only noticing one or the other, or only appreciating one or the other. So.
So you struggle with Shavira?
Definitely, definitely, and pretty much in everything. And I think not just in work, but also in life. Also seeing news, or seeing kind of what goes on in the world, and sort of appreciating different things.
And Daphne, is there one that you identify with?
I think it's funny. I think I'm curious if a lot of people would agree with this one, but just Shabbat. I really try to make time every week, even if it's not on Shabbat, actually, just to kind of take a little bit of time for myself, and to sort of think, reflect a little, just take a break from everything, from technology, from email, from watching social media.
Yeah. Great. I want to read off of the chat. Marcia shared that she struggles with B'Tselem Elohim because it means that also violent people and obnoxious people are also made in the image of God, B'Tselem Elohim. And that's a source of struggle for her. Lillian, have you been able to figure out the unmute? Because I see that you said you'd be willing to share.
Can you hear me here?
Yes, I can hear you.
I think you should be able to hear me. Okay, great.
Yes.
So I, as my strength, it shows Na'aseh v'Nishma, sort of learning by doing. As an experiential educator, like, this is the core of what I am passionate about. But it's also coming from a place where this is how I learn. I've always been a hands-on, sort of dive in and ask questions later sort of person, and that's sort of how I run my programs. And I think it adds a lot of energy to the way that I do my education, but also my Judaism. And then as far as one that I struggle with, Elu v'Elu, this whole, like, there are two sides, and I'm always open to hearing two sides. It's really hard for me to let go of my own opinion and, like, fully accept and, like, understand and listen to, like, an idea that may be so much more different than mine. Even though I fully acknowledge its right to exist, I don't really internalize it.
Mm-hmm. That's very honest. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Hallie. Sorry, I figured out, thanks to Daphne, how to unmute myself. I'm only on the phone, not the Zoom.
Okay.
I also chose Na'aseh v'Nishma that I identify with. I'm definitely a jump in and do it and ask questions later, sometimes much to the dismay of my team. And for me, Shabbat was what I struggled with. It's very hard for me to unplug and step back and carve time out when I'm not thinking about work or all the things that I need to do.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And we can see, as we'll talk about a little bit later, one of the things that often happens in groups is that what one person struggles with, another person identifies with, and vice versa. It can very much be like that. Is there anyone else who'd like to share before we start getting a little bit up onto the balcony and just kind of saying, well, what is this? What are we doing with these? Okay, Jon, I'm going to pass it over to you then to start getting into a little bit of the theory behind Jewish sensibilities.
Okay, great, thank you. And if folks obviously have comments, thoughts, questions, the chat is there. But if you absolutely have to get something in, Lee and I both don't mind having questions on the fly, whatever. It's always tricky when you do these webinars. You sort of feel, is there a world out there? Is there an audience that's actually listening?
Right.
So don't hesitate. So the question that we wanted to pose here is, what do we mean by these things that we call Jewish sensibilities? It's not a term, frankly, that people are necessarily used to. When you talk about Jewish values, I think people, sort of are familiar with that. More recently, there's been a fair amount of talk in the Jewish educational world about character traits, or midot, using the language that comes out of, again, of Jewish tradition. As far as we are aware, the term Jewish sensibilities was first used in the way that we use it by Vanessa Oakes in an article that she wrote for Shema magazine back in 2003. And she then went on to publish some other stuff on this in some academic journals. And essentially what she argued at that time was that there are characteristic ways in which Jews tend to respond to the world, that these aren't necessarily religious in the way that people think about them. You don't have to, associate them with religious belief or even, or religious practice. But if you look at what it is that makes Jews Jewish empirically in the United States, at least in the early part of the 21st century, you can identify a number of characteristic ways that Jews think and feel and behave. And she listed a number of those, and we've, as you've seen, we've created a list that we call a starter list of 10 of these. But we also wanted to drill a little bit more deeply into what these sensibilities really are. So we think of them as what we call cultural memes. These are sort of little nuggets of meaning that are part of the culture that inform how we take in what we experience, how we make sense of it, and then act accordingly. So to take one of the examples that just came up, the notion of na'aseh v'nishma. We see an area where we know we don't know everything that we want to. We have a choice. We can either step back and say, oh boy, I better investigate this. I better learn everything that I can about, how to do this, whatever, and then maybe I'll try it. Or we can say, you know what? Let me give it a try. And in the course of doing it, I'm sure I'll learn more about it. That notion of jumping in and trying things represents a sensibility, and we're suggesting not that it's unique to Jews, it certainly isn't, but that it has roots in Jewish culture and experience over the course of many centuries. The sensibilities that we're interested in are ones that are, in some way, distinctively Jewish. That is to say that they arise from and that they're attested in Jewish narratives and texts and practices. So where is na'aseh v'nishma attested in Jewish tradition? Well, of course, at that moment at Sinai, where the people are told, you have this opportunity to enter into a covenant with God. Here's what the terms of the covenant are, what we think of as Torah, or more narrowly, the Ten Commandments, Aseret HaDibrot. What are you going to do? Well, the answer that the people give at that moment is na'aseh v'nishma. We'll do it. We'll agree. We'll go along. And then we'll figure out what it all means. And that's an instance in Jewish tradition where we can say, that's where na'aseh v'nishma comes from. Now, we believe that there are lots of these Jewish sensibilities, just as we might say there are lots of Jewish values. And it's the combination, the corpus of these sensibilities that together help to answer the question, what does it mean to be Jewish? In a certain sense, we would argue that what it means to be Jewish is to be able to employ this language of Jewish sensibilities. These are, if you will, vocabulary units out of which we construct the sentences, the paragraphs, the stories, the books that constitute the collective product of Jewish lives. And I don't mean that only literally in terms of written, but the stories of our own lives, the things that we do as human beings. Each of us, as the exercise that Lee took us through shows, each of us tends to relate differently to different ones of these sensibilities. It's not the case that you sort of buy the whole package. Some of us are Na'aseh v'nishma people, or Lee alluded to another kind of a sensibility that might go together with that, that we might call a Nachshon sensibility. Nachshon ben Aminadav, who was the first, according to Midrash, to step into the waters of the Red Sea or Sea of Reeds before they even parted, thereby making it possible for that miracle to occur. Some of us are Nachshon types. Others are not, but we might relate to other sensibilities. Others of us perhaps identify more with a concept like Shabbat, stepping back, taking time, reflecting. So it's out of the mix and the conversation among these many sensibilities that the Jewish experience, as it were, is created, and that we are able to have a rich conversation about our own Jewishness, what it means to be Jewish, how we express our Jewishness. It's important to recognize that these sensibilities are not just abstract. They're not just carried in texts. They are carried in the ways in which people actually behave, by seeing what people do and being able to attach a name to it. We make that behavior part of a larger whole, so that if we encounter somebody who is behaving towards somebody else with great patience, with great understanding, we might say there's someone who's manifesting the sensibility of the Tzelem Elokim. They're respecting the other. They're seeing the other as a unique personality. So this is not abstract. And in fact, what we would suggest is that one of the reasons we like the word Jewish sensibility is because it inherently integrates the cognitive, affective, and behavioral domains. Values and character traits are encompassed, and so are emotional dispositions. When we see injustice, we don't react simply rationally and say, oh, that's unfortunate, something should be done about that. We react emotionally, and it's a Jewish sensibility to be angered by injustice to some extent. And again, we can look at the prophets, and we can look at other figures in Jewish history and see examples of how the sensibility of being angered by injustice, if you will, is reflected. And finally, as I suggested, these Jewish sensibilities form a system of interconnected reference points. One of the beautiful things, as you undoubtedly know, about Jewish tradition is that everything is connected to everything else. We don't live our lives looking at single values or single character traits or single sensibilities. Rather, one sensibility will suggest another. Even within this very small list of 10, you could see, for example, how a Lech Lecha and a Na'aseh v'nishma might be connected to one another. And then we go back to the stories, because Lech Lecha is connected with Abraham and Sarah, and Na'aseh v'nishma is connected with the Jewish people at a different moment in their history. Was the moment at Sinai a Lech Lecha moment as well as a Na'aseh v'nishma moment? Maybe, and we can have that conversation. So as we think about these sensibilities, what we're really thinking about is how do we construct out of these building blocks, if you will, terms that each of us may know or can learn, the stories that are associated with them, the practices that are associated with them. How can we each construct in our own way a Jewish life of meaning and purpose? To give this a little bit more concreteness, let's look at something that is, of course, central to the work that you all do, not in our list here, but one that I think could easily be considered a sensibility, and that's tzedakah. So first of all, we know that tzedakah carries multiple layers of meaning. There is no adequate English translation for tzedakah. And in fact, one of the tip-offs that you're dealing with a Jewish sensibility or a Jewish value, whatever, is probably that there's no good translation of the Hebrew term, no single English word that does justice to all of the layers of meaning. So tzedakah, yes, it means caring for the poor through the gift of money. That's the base core meaning of tzedakah. Tzedakah is about giving money to help the poor. We could call that charity, but of course, as soon as you know a little bit about the word tzedakah, you immediately recognize that tzedakah is from the same root as the word tzedek, the word in Hebrew that means justice or righteousness. So there's a statement being made there, a distinctively Jewish statement, by the way, which is different, not better necessarily, but different than the statement that's made when we talk about charity, which of course comes from a root caritas that has to do with love. Because in the Hebrew and in the Jewish understanding of tzedakah, we're not talking about an expression of love. We're talking about an expression of justice. We're talking about something that has to be done because it's the right thing to do. And if we look, of course, at tzedakah, what we see is that there are numerous stories, legal injunctions, and teachings that are connected to it. And it becomes a lens through which we can see, understand, and respond to a variety of human situations. We can ask ourselves, what is called for in this situation according to the notion of tzedakah? And again, tzedakah is more than just an idea. It's also an action and a feeling. It's something that we do. It's not just a value, it's a practice, it's a behavior. And we can analyze that behavior, for example, as Maimonides does, and break it down into different components or different potential ways of enacting this sensibility, if you will. And there's a feeling attached to it. That feeling that I talked about earlier, that this is something that's right. This is something that has to be done. It's an obligation. It's a duty. Mm-hmm. It's not just a generous act. It's something that is built into the way that the world is supposed to work. And finally, we could say that tzedakah immediately calls to mind other sensibilities, other terms. So we often think of tzedakah and chesed as going together. Chesed being, in fact, a Hebrew term that does mean love in a particular way, and the coupling of tzedakah and chesed, the recognition that the two of them go together, that we need both, that we need justice and righteousness, and we also need love and compassion, again represents a distinctive Jewish insight that's embodied in this sensibility. So essentially what we're suggesting is that sensibilities and thinking about different sensibilities provides a point of entry into a whole discourse, a Jewish discourse that has been going on literally for millennia, to which we ourselves contribute, that finds its expression not just in text or in conversation, but also in the way that we behave. And the more we believe that we look at these sensibilities and ask questions about how they relate to our own lives, what we resonate with, as Lee suggested, what we struggle with, what sensibilities are in fact shaping our behavior, what sensibilities perhaps we recoil from because we find them problematic. That is a rich Jewish conversation that enables us to put ourselves in that long line of tradition of Jews trying to give meaning and purpose to their lives with a vocabulary that is rich and evocative and always points beyond the immediate towards the multiple connections that actually constitute the Jewish experience. So I will stop here.
Great.
And turn it back over to Lee to talk a little bit about, okay, so how do you take this 30,000 foot stuff and actually make it come to life in the work that you and others do?
Thank you, Jon. I was really struck with, at the end, when you were talking about the conversation that we are all a part of and what it means to be a part of the Jewish conversation and to have Jewish conversations. So I'm going to speak a little bit now about this, specifically this card deck as a tool, although I want to make sure by the end of the call we talk about how, for us, we see this not just about this deck of cards. Frankly, the deck of cards are, they're just a gimmick to get into the ideas, but they're a gimmick that's worked really well in a lot of contexts. In part, I think because it's often difficult for people when you ask, okay, now we're going to have a Jewish conversation, or now we're going to talk about what it means to be Jewish. It can be very tricky to do that without having some kind of text to base it on, and but at the same time not having too much text and getting too much into the weeds of some of our traditional texts, which some people can find really alienating if they're not approached in the correct way, and just a difficult kind of thing to do. So in effect, what this deck of cards does is it kind of gives you a little mini text that you can have in your hands, so that whoever that you're working with, they may be very, very familiar with some of these terms, or they may be seeing them for the first time. Elu ve'elu is not something that people necessarily get in a Jewish education, although they may have, or the people that you're working with may not have had much Jewish education at all. And so one of the things I've noticed that this gimmick can do is it helps level the playing field around Jewish knowledge, which often can be one of the biggest sort of roadblocks to having a constructive Jewish conversation, is that inevitably in a group of people there are some folks that have sort of more background and some who have less, and it can be really tricky to say, how do we get into these ideas without people having to sort of either shy away because they feel they don't know enough. They might feel, I don't know about this Jewish thing, or I'm a bad Jew. And those people who are like, oh, I know all about this, and I'm show you how much knowledge I have, because that's how they've been rewarded in other contexts. So one way of using these as a tool is definitely as an icebreaker to answer this question together with a group. It could be a group of teens. What does it mean to be Jewish? When is a time in my life that I've really felt Jewish through the lens of some of these ideas? So I want to talk a little bit about some organizations who have already been using this deck and this framework, but I also want to make sure to answer any questions about the practicalities of using them. I've used them with a variety of different groups, mostly anywhere between from teenagers through adults. They're not really designed to be used with children, although in a context with other adults, you could use them with younger children as well. So one way that the framework has been used by an organization is the group present tense. I'm assuming some of you are familiar with their work. They work with entrepreneurs in helping them to get some new and fresh ideas out into the Jewish world as actionable sort of projects. And for years, they really struggled. They knew they were doing a Jewish thing, but they struggled with helping their fellows to be able to speak about, why is this a Jewish idea? What is it that's Jewish? Okay, this is a good idea, but why is it a Jewish idea? And at the same time felt like, there are a lot of good ideas in Judaism that are relevant for entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial kinds of ideas, but how do we make the connection between the two? So Present Tense last year, in full disclosure with a grant from our organization, revamped their curriculum and now all of their training programs, each one starts off with a Jewish sensibility and develops a concept, an entrepreneurial concept in light of that. I observed one last year where, for those of you who are familiar with the way of doing a theory of change for your project or your enterprise, they were learning about theory of change, but they learned it through the lens of Lech Lecha. And it really helped to connect sort of their content to Jewish ideas. So that's one example of somewhere out in the world that's already sort of using this framework. Another that's in process, that's just sort of begun, as Stephanie mentioned at the beginning of the call, my other hat is as a Hillel rabbi. I'm a senior Jewish educator on the campus here of Kent State. And I certainly not only have used these cards with my students here at Kent, but also, frankly, previous generations of students helped me test some of the previous prototypes of this card deck. So working with college students, there are a lot of potentials. And again, because in many environments, and I imagine this is similar with teens as well, people are coming with a variety of different backgrounds, and so it helps both to level the playing field, but it also presents, as John alluded to, you know, there's one level of saying, oh, elu ve'elu, a both and perspective, I get that. 2 Jews, 3 opinions, okay, I get that, yeah, I see that. And then it opens up a gateway. If a person is particularly motivated around that idea or curious about that idea, you could do an entire semester's worth of inquiry into elu ve'elu, because there really is a lot of stuff in the Jewish tradition supporting that particular mindset, that sensibility. So one of the other benefits of this as a framework is that if all you have is you have people for an afternoon, you could do some work with the sensibilities. If you have people for a semester, you could do even a lot more. So that's one way. So Hillel International right now is actually working on a curriculum based on this model to try to offer campuses with a Jewish learning curriculum, a Jewish learning model, a way in through relevance and meaning, but that gets to text and gets to attested traditions. Finally, giving circles. We got a nice email from a local giving circle recently that said, thank you for your cards. We worked, I think it was even a teen environment, that they used them to sit with some teens and clarify values. So you may or may not be familiar. There are a few other card decks out there that are wonderful. 2164 put together a card deck of philanthropic values that people may think of and use while they are making funding decisions. And that's wonderful. The Rose Community Foundation did a deck as well, similarly, which is wonderful. And this is just another tool, another resource that people can speak about. Okay, this is what motivates my Jewishness, and so then therefore here are some guiding sort of mindsets that we as a group may want to include, or as individuals may want to hold as we move forward to giving philanthropically. Great, thanks. Perfect timing for the next slide. So again, this tool can really be used to have what we call a Jewish conversation. Again, like on campus here, where I was like, okay, we want to have Jewish conversations with students. What exactly does that look like, right? How do you start a Jewish conversation? To be able to have someone either pick a card, choose one that is relevant to them. It is a very quick and easy entryway into having a Jewish conversation. Part of this project is from my own experience that this question, what does it mean to be Jewish, is often one that people have a hard time answering, even myself as a rabbi. Now I have an easy time answering because I can say it means elu ve'elu. To some degree, this is a vocabulary project. Both for folks who have not been accustomed with these terms before, as well as people who maybe have been really living these sensibilities, but haven't necessarily had the language around it to say, oh, you know, when I think Jewish, I think lighting Shabbat candles, but actually when I think Jewish, it means that every conversation I have, I'm going to be listening for that other person's opinion to the degree I can, and honoring that their opinion may be as valid as my own as a way of living. Which again, like as we saw in the comments earlier, it can be difficult to do that. But I do believe that that's a very Jewish thing to do, and that helps us in a very positive way to frame what it quote unquote means to be Jewish. as I said before, each one is like a gateway. And because there are many texts and stories associated with each one, if for any educator, they could just take it and run with it. And you could create a whole curriculum. I've had, as Hillel is doing, but I've had educators say, oh, that could be like a 10-week course, and each week we cover a different one of these terms. On the 14th Street Y wrote to us recently, their executive director is using the cards for staff conversations, especially with the staff that is both Jewish and non-Jewish. It can lower the barrier to talking about Jewish ideas. I just want to make sure we point out that, you know, we put together this deck because we wanted to make sure to give people examples of what we meant when we're talking about sensibilities, because examples are so important, getting it out of the abstract and into what we really mean at the same time. So we chose 10, you know, but as Jon said, there are many. And as you get more into sort of rabbinic thought and rabbinic literature, there are literally hundreds. We have a list of like over 100 potential Jewish sensibilities. You know, dan l'chafsechut, giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, is one of the favorite ones that I didn't know about till I was in rabbinical school, and came to learn what an important sensibility that is, and walking through life, and then thinking about older Jews I know who always do that, and isn't that so beautiful? So, but you know, has a lot of words that are tricky to say, so we didn't put them on the cards. But just to point that out as an additional piece, that what we're talking about is not only these specific 10 ideas, but rather a way of thinking of extracting the wisdom that comes out of Jewish tradition and really making it available so that people can apply it to their lives. So now we have a question for you all, and you may have questions for us, which is great. But our question is, having been now made somewhat familiar with the tool and the framework, how might you imagine using Jewish sensibilities in your work? If there's a brave soul who'd be interested in weighing in on this by taking yourself off of mute.
Just a reminder to unmute yourselves. If you're on the computer, you can just press the microphone icon on the bottom left corner of the presentation screen. If you're on the phone, that I know many of you are, you can just simply press *6 to unmute yourself.
Hi, it's Ben Finan from Rose Community Foundation. We actually did an activity with the Jewish Sensibilities cards about 2 weeks ago.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much.
And it worked so well. We split up our group of 18 into pairs and gave each of them a card. Of course, one group got 2. We asked them to read the card and then read the question card that comes with it, and then talk about how that might influence the work that the group is doing together right now, as far as reviewing grant proposals and meeting with grantees, and how that may influence everything. And it was incredibly powerful. It was the first time we'd ever tried it, and we got some very unexpected but very insightful answers.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And I want to point out that, yes, there are the blue cards which have descriptions, and then the green cards have questions on them. The questions are a little deep, some of them. So again, in using them with icebreakers or using them with groups, it can pretty quickly, if people are ready to go there, take people into a layer of conversation that you don't often have with just a first conversation. But thank you so much for sharing. Other folks, how might you imagine using them? Lillian, I'd love to hear your voice, but I noticed you submitted it as a chat, so you may not be able to share. Lillian said, I want to get my teens telling stories from their own lives about times that they exhibited these sensibilities, perhaps drawn randomly, or perhaps times they should have exhibited them and didn't. I think that's wonderful. That certainly lend themselves toward stories. Another direction I would offer for that is asking people to tell a story about a person they know who exhibited the sensibility. Both their own story, or perhaps, you know, a family member or somebody else that really exemplifies a sensibility. Great. Anyone else?
Hi, this is Celeste from the Jewish Community Youth Foundation in Princeton. We
have a staff training in the beginning of the year where we bring together all our advisors, and I think this would be a great activity for them. And I see actually one of our advisors is on the call. So I think this would be a great opening exercise for staff that work with teens.
So my name's Laura. I work with the American Jewish Society for Service. And I'm first of all inspired by the idea of using these for staff, which hadn't quite occurred to me, so that's exciting. And I have actually already been using the Sensibilities since I started this job in February, because we needed to develop like what was the culture of our summer programs, which are service learning programs for Jewish teens. So somebody suggested these to me, and I sort of took them and we ran and developed our own based on it. And I'm still in the midst of figuring out like how do those get translated so that they are like deeply interwoven into all of the activities that we're doing, because we're almost never going to sit down and like pull out a deck of cards and say like, okay, like let's talk about this sensibility, because that's not the type of activities we do on our program. So I was excited to hear how other people are using them, and also to just get connected to the group of people that are sort of thinking about their purpose and use overall.
Great. And Laura, if you ever wanted to chat directly, I'd be happy to chat with you about the use in your context. Yeah. Definitely.
This is Stephanie at JTFN. I just want to share two thoughts. One is that I had the chance, and I first learned about these cards at a conference that was organized, the Collaboratory, where Lee facilitated using these cards as an icebreaker. And just thinking about these cards or other values cards as an icebreaker, I thought was so interesting, because I think particularly with teens, we often go kind of towards the superficial and kind of fun and silly, which definitely, you know, has a place and at times is the most appropriate way to go. But I think for a setting where you may want to kind of create an environment that messages from the outset that A, this is going to be a Jewish space, B, this is going to be a place where we have serious conversations, where we listen to one another, where we kind of go deep in our own explorations. The cards help do that without having to say any of those things. And it was amazing to me to see that, you know, I was sitting next to someone I didn't know, and the instructions were to just turn to the person next to you. And like, we went really deep, really quickly, in a way that surprised us both, in a very positive way. So that was one experience. And building off of that, I know that some teen foundations do some programming or orientation for parents. And I wonder if this might be a useful tool in doing some programming with them.
This is Andrea in Arizona, and we've been using the 2164 cards for several years now with tremendous success, and I like the idea of taking the Sensibilities card and changing things up a bit within the Youth Foundation. I also saw this as a wonderful experience to have with the confirmation kids that I work with. And I also run a Jewish sleepaway camp. And this is a wonderful jumping off point for our staff week, but also I thought with our oldest campers. This would also be a great, one of those tools to just have on the shelf, so when programs don't run long enough, we have something significant to talk about.
Thanks.
Unless anyone else wants to jump in, I've actually got a couple questions here for Lee and Jon, if you want to answer.
Great.
Great. So our first question, which seems pretty relevant to this audience, of course, It's in your experience, if you've experienced this, which Jewish sensibilities seem to resonate most with young people? And I know for this audience, that's mainly teenagers. If you've kind of seen what's sort of caught on, or they've shown less interest in, or anything like that.
Yeah, so I will say, so I don't have a lot of experience using them with teens, except older teens, 18, 19-year-old on campus. Every group that I've used them with, I'm always surprised at the range of which sensibilities people gravitate towards. So I really have not seen any trends of these 10, in almost every group, I know that there are several people that always struggle with Shabbat because taking time for rest is tricky. But besides that, I really, across the board, maybe the only other trend I've noticed with younger people is simcha, joy, seems to be something that people feel really strongly about, that they want to be finding pleasure in life, they want to be having an attitude of joy. And that can happen on both sides in terms of what people both identify with and struggle with. I'll just point out one pedagogical quick thing that I hadn't mentioned earlier. It's definitely important in working with these to ask people what they struggle with, because sometimes if it's not framed as people can have a chance to say, oh, I don't like that idea, or I have a hard time with that idea, it can come across as being a little bit more preachy. Sort of like, here are the Jewish ideas that you need to be, knowing. The same way that Stephanie pointed out that, maybe it was somebody else. I apologize. Somebody pointed out that it can kind of set a tone pretty quickly that we are going to talk about serious ideas without having to say that. Asking people what they struggle with can set a tone that you're allowed to disagree, you're allowed to challenge without saying that. And that's something that I've noticed is really important to use in working with the cards.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think it is very important to make it clear that not everybody resonates with every sensibility. And in fact, we've had some very interesting discussions, probably not for necessarily with teens, about are there sensibilities that we today would reject, that are, how should I put it, are powerfully attested in the Jewish past, but that we today would want to, take away. One that was suggested, for example, was kanaut, zealotry. The notion that one is, passionately committed and zealous for whatever it is that one is passionately committed and zealous for, Torah. I mean, this becomes very relevant in the context of a discussion about Hanukkah, for example. The Maccabees were depicted as being zealous. And in fact, as we know, there's a lot of violence involved in the Hanukkah story. It isn't just all the niceties of finding oil and having it, last for 8 days. And even within Jewish history itself, there are revaluations of certain sensibilities. Depending upon how sophisticated your group is, you can open up some very interesting conversations by asking about sensibilities that people not only may they struggle with, but they may actually find repugnant.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
So I wouldn't make that the primary emphasis.
Yeah.
Far better to talk more about the ones that they identify with. But.
I've got another question here, which seems pretty relevant. Do you have any suggestions for the best text sources to find other Jewish sensibilities? So possibly different ones, kind of the long ones that you've mentioned, or the more complicated ones.
Yeah. So that to answer that question fully would be longer than a 3-minute answer.
Sure.
But what I'll say in terms of resources is that at the very minimum, we've put up the site jewishsensibilities.org as a place where we're starting to link to other material on the web that we think connects well to each sensibility. But there's a lot that could be done. But I encourage people to visit to those places. And of course, if anyone's really interested in this and wants to sort of help partner in helping us flesh this out, please be in touch, because we see a lot of potential of directions. I have a fantasy that there, for those who use Safaria as a tool, I have a fantasy that we may eventually have, a source sheet on Safaria that's open source that people could contribute to for each sensibility that is mentioned or that is identified, and that would be neat, and it hasn't happened yet. So that's, I don't have any specific answers there, but just to say that, stuff is hopefully in the works and coming.
I'll just add that as I mentioned early in my comments, there are other language frames that people talk about: values, midot, character traits. Mm-hmm. We have reasons why we like to talk about sensibilities, but we certainly are not saying, you got to talk about sensibilities, don't talk about Jewish values, don't talk about midot. Yeah. And there are, of course, a number of books about values, midot, ideas. Joseph Telushkin's work, Alan Marinis, who writes about Musar. There are Art Green's book on 10 Great Jewish Ideas. So there are resources. They don't necessarily use the language of sensibilities, but they are resources from which one can draw a larger body of these concepts that that are central to the Jewish vocabulary. I'll just put it in those terms.
Yeah, great. Well, this is Stephanie. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, so I'm going to jump in here if I can. I apologize if there were folks who still had outstanding questions, and I imagine I can speak on Jon and Lee's behalf to say that they would welcome any inquiries or questions of clarification or further resources by email following this webinar. And I'm going to close out by pulling one of the cards I have in the deck here that is resonating with me, as we wind down this call, which is the one of BREAT partnership. The description that's here on the card talks about forging relationships and communities, meaningfully connecting ourselves to others, which is something that has been very important to our work at the Jewish Teen Funders Network. And as we head into Thanksgiving, the sensibility, I don't know what Jewish sensibilities are going to tap to this, but of gratitude.
Hakarat hatov.
Hakarat hatov.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And just the gratitude for all of your partnership and ideas and resources that you've shared with us. I want to say thank you. But most specifically, I want to thank Jon and Lee for leading us in today's webinar and helping our community think about Jewish sensibilities. And thank all of you for participating. And a plug for our next webinar in this series, which will be held on Tuesday, January 21st at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. We'll hear from Catherine Karkoff of the Youth Leadership Institute as she shares her success in building youth-adult partnerships and philanthropy. And we'll have an opportunity to discuss how we might better build these important relationships with our teens. So again, Jon and Lee, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for calling in, and happy Thanksgiving.
Great.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Daphne, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.